Okay, well, it's on the hour now, so I think to try and keep the time schedule, we'll get started now. So thank you everyone for coming to this session on global histories of knowledge. And the first speaker is Matheus Alves Duarte da Silva from the University of St Andrews, whose talk is called The Global Backlands, Circulation of Knowledge and Disease Ecology in Latin America, 1930 to 1960. Welcome, and yeah, please, over to you, Matheus.
Thank you so much. So start sharing here my screen. So I hope you can see my presentation. Okay, great. Okay, so good morning for those in Canada. Good afternoon for those here in Europe. So my name is Matheus Duarte. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of St Andrews. I work in this Wellcome Trust funded project called The Global War Against the Rats and Epistemic Emergence of Zoonosis. And the idea of the project is to understand how rats and other animals were connected with disease. So it's a sort of global history project. But for today, I'll be talk about one specific region, which is the Brazilian Backlands. Okay, so to start. So in September 1897, Euclides da Cunha saw the Backlands, which is called in Portuguese, o Sertão, for the first time. He had been sent to cover as a reporter what would turn out to be the last act of the bloody war of Canudos. Canudos was a settlement of 20,000 people, where its inhabitants create a community at the margin of the law while waiting for doomsday. In October 1897, Canudos fell. The Brazilian army killed most of the men, dispersed the women and orphans around the Backlands, and burned down Canudos, hoping to erase any trace of the events. This endeavor proved futile, though. In 1902, Cunha published his masterpiece, Os Sertões, translated in English as Rebellion in the Backlands. Perhaps one of the most influential books ever written in Brazilian Portuguese, where he reconstructs in a unique style the War of Canudos. The book is divided in three parts, each one portraying an antithesis: the land, the man, and the fight. Rebellion in the Backlands is Hegelian in its dialectic depiction of Brazilian history. But the only clear mention to Hegel appears when Cunha discusses how the Backlands seem to slightly challenge Hegel's geographic division of the world into deserts, valleys, and the coast. As Cunha noticed with humor, Hegel forgot to mention the Backlands and its specificities. In the dry season, the Backlands look like a desert, but in the rainy season, the region appears as a fertile orchard. Therefore, conclude Cunha, the Backlands were a sort of original geographic entity and a sort of civilizational stage between deserts and valleys. Cunha's Hegelian approach of portraying the Backlands as a sort of civilizational backwater became influential in the discourse for the modernization of the Backlands and other rural parts of Brazil, as highlighted by several historians and sociologists. However, few studies have tried to criticize this understanding and present the inhabitants of the Backlands, called in Portuguese os sertanejos, or the Backlanders, as active agents in the production of knowledge. On the other hand, a crucial insight of Cunha is sometimes forgotten by Brazilian historians. The Backlands are not like other Brazilian rural space, and this is because of its semi-desertic environment. In this presentation, I dialogue with this complex intellectual tradition about the Backlands. On the one hand, I want to nuance the long-standing imaginary of the Backlands as a sort of intellectual desert by focus on the role of that inhabitants played on the emergence of medical knowledge about one disease in particular, the plague, a disease caused by a bacillus known today as Yersinia pestis. On the other hand, I discuss how the Backlands, as a semi-arid region, was mobilized by medical experts to explain plague epidemiology in that region. So plague arrived in Brazil in 1899, provoking outbreaks around the coast. In the 20s, it became a disease of rural areas, and in the late 30s, it was endemic in the Backlands, which is this region here, showed by this square. Brazilian experts usually consider that plague was spread by rats, and that the bubonic form of the disease, the most common in the country, was transmitted to humans by the bites of rat fleas. Therefore, the sanitary actions the Brazilian doctors advise and implement were centered on destroying rats. Moreover, it was a common belief among these doctors that the widespread custom of the Backlanders of amassing large quantities of grains and goods inside their house because of the droughts attracts rats. Therefore, the Brazilian experts commonly preach the importance of keeping rats at bay from human habitations. A more controversial point among Brazilian experts concerned the role of wild rodents, such as the animals are called in Portuguese preá, punaré, and mocó, and their ectoparasites in the plague epidemiology in the Backlands. Demonstrating the existence of plague among wild rodents, especially independent from rats, could be a fraught enterprise, particularly in places such as the Backlands, where wild rodents and rats were believed to cohabit, which turned it harder to ascertain whether a plague infection among wild rodents was dependent or not of a previous infection among rats. Therefore, any study about plagues ecology in the Backlands required the help of the lay people of the region. Among these lay actors, hunters and peasants were essential. Hunters knew the ground and the animals and were the first to spot any anomalous dying in the wild areas. Peasants, on the other hand, could potentially observe episodics among rats and wild rodents and indicate which episodic started first. In this presentation, I discuss two studies on plague epidemiology and plague ecology in the Backlands. These two missions were sponsored by the Pan American Health Organization, which will be called as PAHO. Those missions were, the first mission was carried out by Atílio Maquiavelo, a plague expert from Chile, and the second mission by the Argentinian expert José María de la Barrera. By examining these two missions, I will argue that circulation of knowledge between Backlanders, Brazilian doctors, and foreign experts was central to the production of knowledge about plague ecology and plague epidemiology. So let's start with the first mission by Atílio Maquiavelo, which is someone that has a very great name, combining Attila and Machiavelli in the same person. So Maquiavelo was born in 1902 in the city of Antofagasta in Chile, where he had his first contact with plague in 1930. As a result of this experience, Maquiavelo was granted in 1934 a fellowship by the Guggenheim Foundation to spend 12 months in Harvard. Upon his return, Maquiavelo was appointed General Director of Health in Chile, and in 1939, he became a Pan American Health Organization traveling expert. In this new role, he was sent first to Ecuador and then to Brazil. Maquiavelo's mission in Brazil lasted from August 39 to September 1940, and included several localities, most of which were in the Backlands of the states of Ceará, Paraíba, Pernambuco, Alagoas, and Bahia. The Backlands Maquiavelo encountered in 1939 were different from that of the War of Canudos, although some of the social and economic characteristics persisted. Maquiavelo, upon his arrival, immediately sought the help of Brazilian doctors, with whom he visited several rural villages in the Backlands. When visiting this space, the Brazilian doctors and Maquiavelo inspected buildings and discussed the epidemiological situation of the area with the Backlanders. In 1941, Maquiavelo published the official report of his mission. In this, he painted the Backlands as a rural area constantly affected by droughts, which caused misery. Given the widespread poverty, most houses were very simple, built with mud and hay, and most of them contained rat nests in their external and internal parts. According to Maquiavelo, instead of selling the products of their labor, the peasants commonly kept most of the harvest grains and goods inside their house. And I quote, in foreseeing the hard times to come. So the droughts, end of quote. Thus, the house became a granary, attracting the rats. Henceforth, in Machiavelli's reasoning, the specific climatic conditions of the Backlands were responsible for the creation of a particular intimacy between rats and humans, an intimacy that in turn kept plague endemic in that area. Machiavelli thus concludes that rural plague is the biggest problem of the northeast of Brazil. The main point of Machiavelli's argument was that in the Backlands, rats constantly move from one ranch, or called in Portuguese sítio, to another sítio in search of food, especially during the periods of the dry season. To prove this constant migration of rats without a proper system for tracking their movements, Machiavelli resort to the Backlanders, pointing out, and then I quote, that it is frequent to hear that prior to an outbreak of human plague, bands of rats from the fields had arrived in the rural properties, end of quote. In other words, the constant migration of rats within the rural area of the Backlands was not observed by Machiavelli, but by his informants. Machiavelli and the Brazilian experts who follow him also observed directly or were told by their Backlanders informants that rats and even wild rodents died in what were at times massive epizootics. However, according to Machiavelli, in no case could he find these animals infected with plague. In other words, whereas it was possible to state that wild rodents could contract plague, this infection seemed dependent from a previous infection among rats. So to sum up, Machiavelli's rural plague followed this scheme. The Backlands constitutes a semi-arid region encompassing different Brazilian states. Rats were abundant there, given the widespread habit of stocking great quantities of food inside house due to the dry season. Rats moved freely from one habitation to another, a phenomenon repeatedly observed by the Backlanders. When the rats travel, they carry their fleas with them. At times, rat dies in epizootics, in most cases caused by plague. Fleas, a few of them contaminated with the plague bacillus, abandoned the rats and took shelter inside the house. If infected fleas found a rat, then the cycle among rats would resume. If they encounter a human, there was a chance of causing an outbreak. And finally, if they encounter a wild rodent, an epizootic among these animals could follow suit. But an epizootic among wild rodents would have the tendency of extinguishing itself before a plague reservoir could be formed. Machiavelli's ideas on the existence of rural plague in Brazil were met with agreement by most of his Brazilian counterparts. It's worth notice that he did not bring anything entirely new or not previously discussed by the Brazilian doctors regarding the epidemiology of plague in the Backlands. Instead, Machiavelli offered to them, with the weight of his role as a foreign expert, a double target that could easily be translated into political terms. And rat actions could not only bring plague under control, but could also prevent the constitution of a plague reservoir among wild rodents. Drawing upon his conclusions, Brazil created the National Plague Service, called in Portuguese Serviço Nacional de Peste, in 1941. This service applied a sort of military and vertical approach against plague, focused on rat destruction. During the 40s, plague remained a sanitary problem in Brazil, but start to decline in the 50s, perhaps thanks to the anti-rat actions brought by the Plague National Service. Indeed, only 4 human cases were confirmed in 56, the year the Plague National Service was dismantled. But the disease remained endemic in small areas of the Backlands. It was in this context of the decline but persistence of plague that the Pan American Health Organization decided in 1957 to commission the Argentinian José María de la Barrera to study the disease in the Backlands. Barrera was an important plague expert in his home country, where he had particular work to prove that not only rats, but wild rodents contribute to plague epidemiology. Since 1954, Barrera was a traveling expert, and in this role, he visited Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador on missions to study plague and the role played by wild rodents in the endemicity of the disease in those countries. In Brazil, Barrera visits the states of Pernambuco, Ceará, and Bahia from 57 to 58. As Maquiavelo, Barrera counted on the help of doctors, former guards of the Plague National Service, and hunters and farmers, as those you can see here in this picture. These lay actors helped him to capture rats and rodents and understand the complex ecology of plague in the Backlands. According to Barrera, 2 points remained controversial regarding plague epidemiology in the Backlands. First, was the infection of domestic rats a consequence of plague among wild rodents, or were the wild rodents infected by rats? Therefore, Barrera accepted the role played by the rats in the epidemiology of plague in the Backlands, but the question was open whether the rats were infecting the wild rodents or the other way around. Developing his reasoning and contra Maquiavelo, Barrera noted that rats did not seem to wander long distance in the Backlands, but stay in but where the maximum distance from the house he found rats was 1,000 meters. He also mentioned an unpublished study by the Brazilian doctor Alberto Neves, and he also mentioned the fact that nobody in the Backlands had ever witnessed a migration of rats, as previously mentioned by Maquiavelo. Barrera also explained that in the locality of Brejinho, in the Pernambuco state, he found a few dead wild rodents with symptoms of plague. He also mentioned that in the house of Brejinho, no episodic among rats was detected, which suggests that the episodic among wild rodents was not preceded by an episodic among domestic rats in that locality. Finally, he insists that among the rats captured inside the house in Brejinho, none of them presented signs of plague. Take these points in consideration, he concludes that plague in the Backlands had the double character of being domestic and sylvatic. In other words, according to Barrera, wild rodents were the main reservoir of plague in the Backlands, but rats also participate in the epidemiology of plague. Therefore, any anti-plague policy should remain targeting rats and pushing them away from the house. At the Pan American Health Organization in Washington, Barrera's report and conclusions on the existence of a reservoir among wild rodents became an important source for rethinking plague epidemiology in Brazil. But in Brazil, in contrast, the Barrera's report had only a small impact, and his conclusions were only accepted later. So to conclude, I would like to insist that the Backlands were not only an object of knowledge, but also a place where new knowledge could emerge. Indeed, both Maquiavelo and Barrera construct their conclusions about the Backlands and the Backlands plague epidemiology because they stayed 1 year in the region, observing humans and their relationship with rats and rodents, and trying to understand the habits of these animals and their interactions. More important, these experts construct their respective epidemiological reasoning about plague in the Backlands thanks to their interactions with actors working and living there. This case study suggests then that rural actors were active agents in the construction of knowledge about disease in rural settings. Nonetheless, this assertion should be seen with caution, as the knowledge of the Backlanders could appear contradictory, as the information about rat migration with the Backlands could suggest. Rat migration was a phenomenon witnessed by several people, according to Machiavelli, but a fact never observed, according to Barrera. Therefore, the scientific corpus about plague in the Backlands should be seen as reflecting knowledge by different actors, foreign experts, Brazilian doctors, and the Backlanders, but not necessarily as a synthesis, rather as a selection operated by the foreign experts. Accepting the Backlands, the Brazilian doctors working there and the Backlanders were central to the production of knowledge on plague in Brazil could lead us back to Euclides da Cunha and then to Hegel. Even though most Brazilians have never read Rebellion in the Backlands, they probably know one sentence from the book. And the sentence is the following: the Backlands will turn to the beach and the beach will turn to the Backlands, as this was repeated with some modifications in movies and popular songs. The sentence is a millenarian prophecy attributed by Cunha to Antônio Conselheiro, the leader of Canudos, which could be read as an announcement of the coming of end of times. In this presentation, I made a case to turn, metaphorically, the Backlands into a Hegelian coast. In other words, as a region open to the outer world and where new ideas and knowledge emerge, in that case, about plague epidemiology in a rural semi-arid space. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Let's open to questions, either from online, from Zoom, or from the room. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, I'm happy to start us off. It was a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. It's a topic I know nothing about, so apologies for the very basic nature of my question. So something that interested me was if there's any sort of pattern you're seeing also among characterizations of Backlanders and then parallel forms of racialization happening in Brazil. Because the photo you showed with the 3 people, I think, that really, yeah, I was wondering if you could say more about if you've come across discussions of racial discourses linked to a question of rurality, wildness.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is a very central question, and also a central question for Euclides da Cunha, because he develops a sort of strange argument if we compare with other parts of South America and of the Americas. Because according to him, the real Brazilian race is not the mestizo of the coast. The real Brazilian race is the Backlanders, because there you have sort of a mix between the 3 races that form Brazil. So the indigenous, the black, and the white. So for him, this is the real race that was being destroyed by the Brazilian army when they arrived there. And in some sense, this idea that these people from the Backlanders, they are different. So it's a different race from the black and from the white and from the mestizo of the coast. This is very central in these examinations of the epidemiology of plague that carried on by these plague experts, these foreign plague experts, but also for the Brazilian plague experts, because for them, they are in a way in contact with a different sort of population, with a different sort of race of Brazil. And for them, the idea that is the desert that is creating this race is something that but is very present in Euclides da Cunha and in all these examinations of the plague. So just to give you a very short answers, for them, yes, for these experts, they are in a way thinking about and trying to act upon a different Brazilian race. So, I mean, this is the Brazilian race for them.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid we have a really tight schedule, so we're going to move on to the next speaker. But please join me in thanking Matheus.
Thank you so much.
So our next speaker is Emma Su from the East-West Center Student Affiliate, University of Hawaii at Manoa. And Emma's going to give a talk called Fractal Episteme, viewing the Macartney mission with distance and angle.
you. So my name is Emma from the University of Hawaii. So I'll just give a brief overview of the things I'll go over today. First, my research for this particular talk is focused on the Dinwiddie Fonds. So this is actually at Dalhousie University, and I'll go over this quickly. And then second, on the worlding of history, talking about from our department, this process of worlding history. And then last, how to apply this concept in history. So quickly over the Dinwiddie Fonds. This was actually preserved by Dr. Dinwiddie, who was the chief astronomer or chief scientist of the Macartney mission. So his grandson, William J. Proudfoot, preserved his records, and these records helped him to write the biographical memoir of James Dinwiddie. This was published in 1868. And then all of these records moved throughout Canada, immigrated with his family, and then ended up here at Dalhousie and became public around 1999. So the archive itself contains about 83 personal journals. Some of them were written by Dinwiddie, some of them were written by Proudfoot. And among them are also lecture notes, scientific journals. So I think it's a great resource for anybody researching that period. But the main thing is these records were not made public until about 131 years after the memoir was published. So the relationship between the three are interesting to look at. So George Macartney obviously was a diplomat. James Dinwiddie was on the mission as a scientist. Originally, he was the mechanics, but because they wanted to convince the Chinese embassy of his importance in the mission, so they changed him to the astronomer, but also the chief scientist. His view of the embassy was that he was largely disappointed, so he felt like there wasn't enough preparation or planning. So a lot of people felt like his accounts were marginalized. And then William Proudfoot, the grandson of Dinwiddie, wrote basically an expose of John Barrow, who was also on the mission, saying that a lot of his accounts were inaccurate. So yesterday I was just in the archives and going through Proudfoot's journal, and he wrote in August 14, 1849, he said, "Finished this morning Barrow's autobiography. In the whole of my experience, I have never met an author so anxious to sound his own praise." And before that, on March 18th, he complained that a journal had publicized that Barrow had erected the instruments in the Macartney mission, which he disputes was his grandfather's contribution. And so there was this scornful perspective on Barrow, and I think on the official narrative coming out of the Dinwiddie mission. So just to give an example, even Proudfoot's account, I think, had some issues with how he read his own grandfather's account. This is just a small excerpt, but for example, in Proudfoot's version, he said that the Chinese official pronounced English words with great readiness, such as "very well, how do you do," but labored in vain at broth. But if you look at Dinwiddie's original records, his emphasis was on pronounced English words with great readiness, words with, except the words with letter R. And the example was broth. And so there's kind of this, I think, misquoting or misrepresentation of what Dinwiddie was trying to get at. And this is just in a small example, which I think if you do more comparison across the records, will reveal kind of more interesting things. And this is significant because Proudfoot's memoir has been quoted a lot when you talk about the Dinwiddie, the Macartney mission, for example, in James Hebbia's Cherishing Men Far Afar. So going to the worlding process, this is something at our university, I think we're trying to think through, so I welcome any discussion, but it is thinking about the elsewhere and the otherwise. So instead of kind of the objective truth, we're trying to shift to the subjective dimension beyond just replicating what exists and assuming that worlds exist equally. So from a subjective point of view, there are all these different possibilities of worlds that are existing unequally. So this is just a definition from the Bloomsbury Handbook of World Theory. For our department, the person who started world history, Jerry Bentley, was in our department at the University of Hawaii. So he pioneered this concept of world history during a time when it was very siloed. It was focused on country or region, and I think he was trying to break across those silos. And so at that time, at least, world history was kind of seen as the antithesis of professionalism among historians. And so I think this is kind of another shift in maybe not being so professional by focusing a little bit more on subjective aspects. So going beyond theory, my research, I'm more interested in how to apply multi-perspectivity. So multi-perspectivity is something the Council of Europe, in their discussion of how to teach history, you can see on the right side, is kind of fundamental to history as a discipline. But I think a lot of the textbooks or a lot of the kind of research coming out does not draw that ambiguity or the contradictions out as much. So thinking about Rashomon, it's a Japanese movie where there's a court case for a murder. So a samurai was murdered, there's a bandit, there's his wife, and then there's the dead samurai speaking through a spirit medium. And so, you know, each person is trying to represent their ideal self. The bandit says he seduced the samurai's wife, and then she fled after he successfully defeats the samurai. And then the wife says she was raped by the bandit, but the samurai treated her with contempt, and so she fainted trying to defend herself. So when she woke up, the samurai was dead. And then the samurai, speaking through the medium, says he killed himself after his wife accepted the bandit's marriage proposal. So each person was trying to tell their own subjective, kind of unequally existing worlds. And so applying this to history, I think it's a great device for creating ambiguity and kind of inconclusiveness to conflicting accounts of the same event. And so my broader kind of dissertation topic is actually on worlding the concept of time. So time is, to me, really interesting because there's both kind of the extent or the existing kind of measurable, correct time, but there's also the elsewhere or the otherwise of time. So there's kind of incalculable or virtual, kind of relational time. So I am particularly interested in trying to use the concept of time to think about the medium question. After reading Arvin Wong's China Transformed, who was a close collaborator of Ken's comrades, who, you know, from the California school, his China Transformed said one of his arguments was that technology's role is mainly in accelerating change, but not catalyzing the shift from rural to urban industry. So I was not sure if that completely satisfied me. To me, a divergence could just simply be the change in the rate of acceleration. And so if you look at these two, you know, it's just velocity of time. And so how are you thinking about time? So that's kind of my broader research. And going back to kind of this thinking of world theory, worlding theory, the story of time is both a process and a project. So how we define project is something that's high in human agency or attention. So for example, time zones as an imperial project. But time can also be a natural process, the result of the sun's position. So this is kind of lower human agency or unintentional. So in the application of worlding theory, the tool that I'm using Dinwiddie's documents to add a difference in intention, so the scientist versus the diplomat, which is set in the context of an increasingly standardized and mechanical time, that confronts the natural and local subjective time. So in China at that time, the main timing device was incense clocks and water clocks. And so those timing units were mainly 15 minutes to around 2 hours versus mechanical time, it could be down to the second. And so if you're thinking about rate of change and rate of acceleration, if you have different timing units, the control of railways depended on clocks. So how does that then influence kind of this transformation into modern science? And then using different sources, so Pratt's biography of Dinwiddie, his intentions could be to protect his family's honor, but it also could have been to attract attention towards his own publications. And so I think Dalhousie's archive will be a great resource that I would work on. And then, Macartney's own recollection of the embassy, some say it was to save face for the failure, but others have argued that, maybe it was strategic to leave room so that you could go back and try again. So it's right now, I think it's interesting, 3 different perspectives to kind of play against each other. And then the last couple of slides, just cognitive distance. When you think about the Rashomon effect, there's actually a 4th person, which is the judge. And that is ultimately the reader who is reading this history and trying to come to their own conclusions, trying to add their own subjective experience into reading this. So, they have to think about, the student or the reader has to think about what is the otherwise and elsewhere. These people that are presenting their facts, how do we engage the student imagination to think about, well, who is the unreliable narrator? What is missing here, and what are further questions to ask for this research? And so in conclusion, this is kind of my thinking of Fractal, is that it's infinitely complex, but it's a pattern. And so it's self-similar across different scales. When you're looking at microhistory, it also reflects kind of the broader scale dynamics. So yesterday, there was talk about being a cat and a dog. I think, this is maybe a potential way to approach being the sea cucumber or the cauliflower. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk. Yeah, let's open up to questions. Yeah, it's good. We have time.
Yes. I'm so delighted by this presentation. It was just amazing. So I guess I've got like 1.5 questions, which the first one kind of a yes, no, because I'm always interested in the fact of how archives are kind of in a way hidden behind the very nature of archives, and you transcribing some of the quotes from the Dinwiddie papers. I'm wondering if there's a possible plan of yourself or someone else, or perhaps the archives, if they're planning on digitizing like the contents of it.
Yeah.
My second question though, is about this conception of history or how we write that history, right? So like, how do you think as a historian that we should write history when it's clear that all perspectives are subjective, right? Like the Rashomon effect clearly demonstrates that there's no objective participant, right? And so that, I think, is a very fascinating complication of how we think about if history is objective or not. So how do you kind of grapple with that?
Yeah, okay, cool, thank you. Should I just go?
Yeah.
Okay. So digitize, yes. They actually had a donation that helped them to digitize most of the archive, and so it's really easy to search. But this is my first time visiting it in person, and when I actually went to look at the records, there are documents that have, for example, 9 pages scanned, but if you look at the physical thing, there's like 200 pages. And so you realize that, okay, their digitization is maybe very partial, and so you can get a glimpse into the dates or who is writing this, but you can't get the whole thing yet. So I'll probably have to spend some money or get a grant or something to digitize the rest. But right now it is online already, a large chunk of it. And then the kind of follow-on thing about digitization is it's such a huge archive, actually. And because the handwriting, like it takes a lot of time to transcribe, I think right now OCR is a good tool to use as well, especially if they have high resolution digitization. There's a lot of open source tools that you can use, and you can start to search keywords to find them. And about writing history from all perspectives that are subjective, yeah, I think trying to like the graph that I showed with the chart that I showed with the process and project, it's a spectrum. So thinking about intention, like what is the human intentional project right now, and what is the kind of resulting process? I think it's really hard to. It's a spectrum, so it's really hard to say exactly if this is a human thing or this is like a process thing. But I think the more important thing is to highlight that there are these contradictions, or that there are these agendas or intentions behind it, and for the reader to decide. Because I think a lot of times when we write, there's almost like this need to make a solid argument, but sometimes I think it's okay to leave the reader to decide.
I'm going to make use of chair's privilege. It was an absolutely fantastic talk, and I've got millions of questions. I'm struggling to choose one, but one of them is, do you think there's something also in the sorts of routes along which these people traveled, Dinwiddie, Macartney, Barrow, in then making them think about time, temporality, and like also stages of time? So Barrow, I know more about Barrow than about Dinwiddie, but like Barrow goes to South Africa, he marries a South African and stays there for quite a long time. And in his published account of his travels to the interior of Southern Africa, he always uses China as a marker to then like calibrate the age of the son of the Khoi, of like different populations he meets. China's almost always there as this, this standard. And you know, he speaks extensively about chronology, about chronometry, and you know, do you think there's something to try and move the theoretical questions into something that can be periodized? Perhaps you can say, okay, these kinds of routes shaped these kinds of imaginings of time. Yeah,
that's a really interesting question. So I think, again, kind of adding that individual actor's stories, like the routes that they've traveled. Dinwiddie himself, he was a Scottish, he got his degree from the University of Edinburgh, and then he was actually financially kind of not managing his money very well. He acquired a lot of instruments, and he was kind of on this mission, I think, to earn a little bit more money because he was kind of in debt. So, you know, there's all these backstories to these people and how they're thinking about what's happening in front of them right now. And so Dinwiddie actually later went on to Calcutta, and he had held one of the biggest lectures there, and, you know, had been oversubscribed. And so all these stories kind of go into how they write about themselves in their journals. In terms of chronology, I think it's really interesting that you bring up kind of trying to be Barrow's anchoring point almost of like understanding chronology and time, because in China, even the emperor himself, I think he was kind of the center, and the emperor was kind of in charge of defining time. A lot of his legitimacy was based on correctly predicting solar eclipses, you know, lunar eclipses and so on. So I would have to think a little bit more about how that all ties together, like after their trip to China, and then their route continues, and what are they doing with them? So I think this kind of goes along with the theme of circulating knowledge, or, you know, just everything kind of tying together.
that's fantastic. And it almost feels as if the particular historicizable journeys that these people went on fed into their attempt to create a view from nowhere.
Right.
At time.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions? I've taken up far too much.
Thank you. That was really intriguing talk. I wonder, as you went through the manuscript by the son, what's his last name?
Proudfoot.
Proudfoot, and the way that he retells the breakfast Backlands.
Mhm.
What, within these sort of two bodies of text,
Mhm.
you see them sort of constructing different timescales in their design? And how?
That's interesting. So Proudfoot, I literally like 2 days ago started to go through it in detail. And so that quote that I got was actually just from yesterday reading it, and just kind of flipping through it. Oh, okay. So I can't say for sure about Proudfoot yet, but just thinking about the fact that it's 131 years apart, the way, the kind of pervasiveness of timekeeping devices, I imagine would be different. And so, the use of railways, the more precise, almost like synchrony of everybody, like social time, I think would be different. But I don't have, concrete evidence yet. Just thinking about their different backgrounds. That's what I would.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, and please join me. Thank you. So our next speaker is Michael Quinn from the University of Glasgow, who will be giving a talk called "The Land Owns Us: Learning the Global History of the Natural World Through Indigenous Creation Stories." Michael, over to you.
Hi there, thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. I'll just share my screen. And hopefully, yep, there we go. Yeah, perfect. So yes, my name is Michael Quinn. I'm talking from Scotland. Good morning to you all, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I suppose my talk today is in a very kind of similar vein with Emma's talk just there, with a slightly different perspective. So yes, I'm kind of talking from the perspective of the philosophy of education. So in terms of like the conference aims, I'm looking at the one about exploring pedagogical issues specific to the teaching of a global history of the knowledge of the natural world. And this kind of relates to my own PhD thesis. So I'm looking at how to teach philosophy through examples of fiction, particularly like science fiction and speculative fiction and things like that as well. So today, what I'd like to do, first of all, is just kind of go through like what the contents are. So I've got the context of this discussion that I've got is the philosophy and literature, and then philosophy of education. I'll then look at science and stories and how these two perspectives of the world kind of are in conflict, but how they don't necessarily need to be, and how they can actually enhance each other. I'll then look at Uluru, which is the example from Australia that I want to talk about in some more detail. Apologies for that awful photo, but I thought I might as well embarrass myself to get things started. And then just some teaching tasks, which I would kind of suggest with this kind of approach in mind, with what I'm about to talk about. So, yes, philosophy and literature. So in philosophy, there's this kind of big debate about whether literature does count as philosophy or whether it's separate. There are calls for literature to be recognized as philosophy to challenge the cultural homogeneity of Western philosophy. So with this idea in mind, it allows for the effective teaching of diverse understandings of the global history of the natural world, and it encourages, I think, empathy and respect for different voices, perspectives, and apparent contradictions. It also kind of brings a move towards a more inclusive understanding of philosophical ideas in the world, and importantly, a move away from Western philosophy, ideals, and educational aims. So along these lines, we've got Lynn Glueck and Harry Brighouse, and they talk about the importance of using children's literature to learn about morality and learn about the world more generally. And they argue that, that children's literature can be used to gently introduce children to a category of intellectual question and make children familiar with the kinds of questions they will investigate at an age-appropriate time. And the benefits that they point out for this approach is they've got the idea of that children can kind of reason about moral decisions, and they can do it kind of externally from themselves. We're kind of capitalizing on prior knowledge of fictional narratives. So as they go along a story that they're familiar with, they can kind of think about these big kind of questions, and also gasp that they actually might enjoy the whole process as well. But what this also does for like what I'm talking about today is like it elicits empathy, especially for like the kind of things that we wouldn't normally draw attention to. So if we think about the way that morality is often taught in schools, it's often about people, whereas this looks at like places and animals and things like that as well. So that brings us to the philosophy of education. So there's a kind of this rise of knowledge-based, content-heavy approaches in education that deprive students from the opportunity to like critically engage with the natural world. And we want to encourage students to critically reflect on their relationship with the natural world as a dynamic entity and to reflect on the products of human cultures equally as products of nature. So we kind of have this move away from these kind of factually dominated pedagogies. When I was teaching in Australia, I saw a lot of this. It was just like the more you know, that the better things will be. And then it kind of brings us to this kind of, you've got stories and science and truth and how these might relate with each other. Obviously, with education just now, there's massive focus on truth. But of course, stories and science are really important as well. So we think about creation stories, they're not necessarily in conflict with science, they may actually be enhanced by it. I'll return to this later. But both can be seen as true and meaningful and useful and valuable simultaneously, I believe. And what I'm thinking about here is like the example of like fiction in the real world and how they kind of relate to each other. So if you think about these massive stories, especially in fantasy, like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, you do have people who move through the world and they see it differently because of these stories, and they actually are taken to different places in which they wouldn't have really thought about or paid attention to as well. Like I literally went to New Zealand just to go and see all the different scenes from like Lord of the Rings films. And like you go to London and people go to like King's Cross and things like that as well. So it's just this idea about it's a kind of brief example, I suppose, of the power of stories and how they can bring attention to different parts of the world. So if we're thinking about science and stories more specifically, Paul Feyerabend talks about theories and myths that have the very same goal, to collect and causally explain salient appearances. Even the method is the same. It consists in drawing conclusions from existing observations. The differences in the results are due to the limitations of the observation material available to the myth's original creators. But the difference comes from the different ways that cultures look at the world and what is most salient to them. Western view, arguably, is quite scientific and is all about finding the answer, whereas, especially in Australia, the Indigenous perspective is about a kind of more kind of general search for meaning. In this sense, the limitations of the observation material are, to an extent, redundant for the myth. But for Feyerabend, it does go on and talks about the facts of the world are not just externally reflected by human ideology, but are, at least in part, formed by them. And I think this is more agreeable. So what we often perceive as facts is simply another interpretation of the world around us, and then therefore trying to balance the importance of science and storytelling with students. As I've suggested, in schools, the importance of science is often put above stories. But also suggests the power of language. So languages tend to change, they degenerate or develop, and what at first cannot be uttered may become a fundamental principle, often just because the imperfection of the language existing state is initially perceived in a manner that cannot be articulated linguistically. So we've got this idea then of the importance of story and the importance to articulate the way we view the world around us and interpret that as well. And it offers, I think, if you look at, when I look at this example with Uluru in Australia, it offered the students a different way to look at the world. So, yeah, and sorry, a way to do that then, a way to think about science and stories together is what Mark Turner refers to as this kind of conceptual blending. So creation myths, such as the Indigenous Australians' Dreamtime stories, they help students to understand that allegorical, figurative, and literal understandings of nature and the world are not in conflict. And this conceptual blending is a fundamental instrument of the everyday mind, which is used in a basic construal of all our realities, from the social to the scientific. But what exactly is conceptual blending? So this is kind of like an example of it, and if it doesn't make sense, then that's kind of good. That's kind of the point. So a Buddhist monk begins at dawn one day, walking up a mountain, reaches the top at sunset, meditates at the top for several days until one dawn, when he begins to walk back to the foot of the mountain, which he reaches at sunset. Making no assumptions about his starting or stopping, about his pace during the trips, prove that there is a place on the path which he occupies at the same hour of the same day on the two separate journeys. So, of course, we normally think that this is something that that can happen because there's only one monk and this thing like that. There's no kind of like trick riddle here. The idea of solving this problem is imagining a scenario in which the monk simultaneously goes up and down the mountain on the same day. So with the problem described in this new way, we understand that there must be a place and time when the monk therefore meets himself on his journey. A scenario in which the monk goes up one day is represented in this case as one input space, and when he goes down is recognized as a second input space. So the blended space, this is where the both inputs are put together, is where the kind of integration happens. So there are some elements such as the path and the mountain that stay the same throughout both inputs, but there are others that have to be blended into one, such as the monk himself. So like both inputs are kind of occurring at the same time. So what happens then if you run this new structure, it then leads to the monk kind of meeting himself. As I said, it doesn't entirely make sense as we think about it, but it's the idea that these two things can exist at the same time, even if we don't normally think of them belonging together. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to make sense, nor does it have to. So if we're thinking about conceptual blending, if we think about it in that way, we don't therefore need to say, oh, I believe in science and I don't believe in stories, or I believe in stories, therefore I don't believe in science. You can believe in them both. And I think this then leads us quite nicely back to like the Indigenous perspective on the environment. So there's an importance in Indigenous culture of environmental philosophies, and without this richness of narrative subjects that define and elaborate place, the connection between lived experience and the sense of this interweaving is lost along with sensitivity to place. And that's what I really want to focus on here, this idea of being sensitive to where we are. And with the kind of questions in mind of what do we owe to others, including future generations, when it comes to the environment, and then what about animals, and of course, what about the land? And this environmental philosophy appears in different areas as well, such as the philosophy of attention. So Iris Murdoch talks about unselfing, Simone Weil talks about decreation. And the idea is that our ego must be silenced in order for us to fully grasp this sense and reality. So when we are engaging with the land, we're not focusing on what we want from the land, but instead of what we can offer it or how we can share the space rather than take over it. And this is much closer to an Indigenous philosophy, perspective of the land, when contrasted with the idea of like private property. So hence the land owns us. And this can transfer to other things, such as the naming of plants and animals, and lead to more empathetic responses. But of course, what does this all have to do with Uluru? So I'm going to kind of go through very quickly the kind of Uluru story, and then I'll kind of bring back the different ideas that I've kind of brought up in the first half of the talk. So long, long ago in the dream time, animals gave shape to some of the rock. At that time, a young woma python called Kunia was surprised by a group of liru, which are venomous snakes. The liru threw spears at the python and killed him. So hard did they throw their spears that the points made holes in the rock. The boy's aunt, also called Kunia, was so angry that she killed one of the liru with her stick. They made holes in the rock when the points of Kunia's stick hit it. You can still see these holes today. Kunia, the woma python, can still be seen as a dark wavy line on Uluru. And I think Uluru is a really useful example of this blending, as it allows students, because of its it's a good example of this because it allows students to explore its religious, historical, and political significance in the world. It's obviously a massively recognised landmark in Australia, and it's got special significance to Indigenous Australians, particularly the Arangu, traditional owners of the area. It is listed as UNESCO World Heritage Site and a popular tourist destination since the 1930s, but significant to the Arangu culture for tens of thousands of years. So, I just want to briefly show you this video. So this is Barbara Chikatu, a traditional owner of the Uluru Kata Tjuta region, and it's her telling a different, another creation story of Uluru. Hopefully the sound works. If it doesn't, just start waving, please.
The creation beings have left their mark on the Uluru landscape and give important lessons on how to behave.
Ono balu banyan. Kuni balu. Nyara. Nyara wadi bikin. Nyara ngala ko. Kalau ngam para bara wandi ada mun nyara ngala. Wadi pichala nyara ngala nyinga nyara. Ngono balu wadi pichala. Nyanga je wadi pichamo. Wadi idara ngala. Baba nyaranda wang langko juga coba aku dari balu idara ngala. Pijan jarang ngunangani. Wadi pichala. Wadi idara ngala. Balu nyara coba nyaman Panda. Yang mandia Johnny Palumba. All perawan. Mano. Palu banyak. Waile real pelipikar ingula. Pokoknya Palumba. Kone Palumba wadi benda. Palaj. Nyarang lagi kado.
Okay, so first of all, I think it's really important to hear the story in its traditional language, to focus less on the story and more on how it's told. But when we do look at how it's told as well, and we think about the importance of the present tense. So she talks about how the Python is moving across. This is something that is happening just now. She also talks about the context in which this takes place. So she actually points over and she says you can see her over there. So again, this is happening right now. And finally, the kind of emotional intensity of these stories as well, I think they'd be really important for students, because they've got these characters who are enraged and angry and all that kind of things as well. And as I'll kind of mention when I conclude, we can kind of bring this back to students' own personal experiences. So these stories tell the creation of the land and the people, but they also functioned as a map with important lessons about land and how to care for country and how to survive in really kind of harsh environments. It's a religious philosophy, it's a moral compass, and Chikupa is not written down. It is shared from person to person through oral storytelling, through art, and also through songs and ceremonies. And Chikupa can be seen at Uluru through the physical evidence of the activities of the ancestral beings that still exist in the land. So when you walk through Uluru, and I'd recommend that you go if you've not been, you can actually see examples of these as you walk through. So what you can see in this picture here, you've got the story of Chatty, the small red lizard who lived in the Mulgee Flats. He threw his Callie a curved throwing stick and it became embedded in the surface, and he used his hands to scoop it out. In his efforts to retrieve his Callie, you can see the kind of series of bowl-shaped hollows. So you can actually see there at the top, it looks like someone has actually tried to scoop something out. We've also got the cave where Chatty died at Kanju, unable to recover his Callie. He finally died in his cave. His implements and bodily remains survive as large boulders on the floor. So what I think is really important here for these particular parts especially, I suppose, is that, again, they draw attention to these different aspects and these different places that we never would have thought about before. If no one had told these stories, then people wouldn't really stop and think, oh wow, or these particular parts of these amazing landmarks, they wouldn't focus on them on the same way. So why Uluru? Cultural and spiritual significance. When you're there, you can actually see the colours of the rock change at sunset, and it's just magnificent. And I think there's a really strong and clear connection with the importance of the land and its markings in the story. I think this makes it a lot easier for students to see the connection between the stories and and the actual the physical construct itself. It has been quite a controversial place as well, with people that used to kind of climb up it despite the wishes of the Indigenous to the contrary. And I think in Australia, at least I can speak to that a little bit. I haven't taught there for a few years, that there's there's an improvement of teaching Indigenous culture in high schools, but a lot of it has been quite a negative and apologetic perspective. So they talk about the stolen generation, and they talk about all these terrible things that happened. But I feel there's a lack of celebration of the vibrancy of the culture, and it's, I suppose, neglecting that there's so much to learn from Indigenous perspectives as well. And I think an importance of the folks in the oral tradition too, just bringing people back to the present and telling stories and being with each other in the same room, he said, from Zoom in a different country. But yeah, so if we're going to have this perspective, then there's a couple of teaching tasks that we could do to bring this into the classroom. So you could have like a match-up activity where you have like different parts of the story that are mashed up, and like the students have to bring them together to see how they would logically construct it. You could have character interpretation. So why can you act in this way? What can we learn from this? And you could have students kind of bring that back to their own personal experiences. Like, what do you do when a family member does that? And again, it's kind of back to what I mentioned before with with Lynn Glick and Harry Brickhouse about externalizing these kind of moral decisions so that students can make these choices without feeling that like the onus is on them. Basically, it lowers the stakes, but brings their attention back to the land. And then there's like an exemplar task that you could do. So for instance, my sister and I had this idea about if our back garden could talk, like what would it say? And it was like this really idea and interesting perspective on time, because the garden could talk about, the first time that my father stepped foot there, and like the last time that, my gran was there and stuff like that. And she wrote this like amazing song that she won't let me share with anyone, but it was really, really good, and it had that kind of perspective in mind. So you could have students do something like that as well. So you could have them select a natural place that they're familiar with, and they like maybe bring in a photo of that, and they focus on one particular aspect of the land. And then they could kind of create their own story of how it came to be. So if they had like a really interestingly shaped tree, or if like they had a hollow somewhere, like how would they describe how that kind of came to be? And we don't want them to like worry about, it was a storm and it harmed the tree, whatever. It was like, what's an interesting story that would kind of make them focus on that particular part of the land, kind of more emotionally and philosophically as well. So, what can we conclude from today? So we've got this kind of conceptual blending of fact, fiction, and belief, and we're not putting one above the other. We're trying to make them much more equal. We're diverting our attention to important aspects of nature in our daily lives. So doing this through the potential of stories to bring places to life and the power of sharing stories. And we're understanding the importance, especially of minority groups, when we're encouraging students to learn about other perspectives. And then attention is shifted outwards towards the world and away from ourselves, and the various ways that we can understand, interpret, and appreciate the land through an appreciation of place. And finally, most importantly, it signals a shift away from what the land can give us, and through a more mutual and reciprocal partnership, more towards what we can offer the land. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So do we have any questions? Any questions from the audience, either online or in the room? Otherwise, I'm happy to get us started. Thanks for a brilliant presentation. It's great to see Feyerabend sort of slowly emerging back, and a really good friend and colleague of mine, Rory Kent in Cambridge, they're finishing their PhD now on Feyerabend and the philosophy of science. So do you want to get in contact with them? Rory Kent is definitely someone. Something that came to mind, and I want to be mindful not to shift this story and this account that you're telling to Europe, because I think it's very important that you are engaging with Indigenous Australian stories. But something that came to mind, particularly because you mentioned Feyerabend and stories, is his close friendship with Bertolt Brecht in Vienna. And Brecht writes so much about the power of stories in creating this defamiliarization effect, where you can then suddenly, like, everything clicks into place. You encounter something that's so difficult to square in your mind, and Brecht himself then, to some extent, acknowledges a Chinese Buddhist intellectual tradition in like the sort of the moment of realization, basically, when different elements of stories seem so distant, and then you get struck by lightning and everything falls into place. So I'm just wondering if that's also if that can be yet another sort of thread to weave into the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. Actually, I think unintentionally there was some kind of Brechtian perspective. Like, so when I told the story of Uluru, I wanted to tell that first, so that when you listen to Barbara's telling of the story, you weren't focused on what was going to happen. You were focused on like the actual telling of the story. And obviously Brecht was very kind of big on that. Like, here's the synopsis, and now let's go and enjoy it. And I think especially when it comes to like stories about the land, like often these stories have happened. So like as I was saying, like with the idea, if you're going to write a story about a particular place, then it's already occurred. It's often about how did this come to be the way it is, instead of like what's going to happen later. And I think especially today, like we're massively in a culture of spoilers. Like we're really, really concerned about like what is going to happen. And these stories, like Brecht, they offer the kind of opposite perspective. It's like, right, let's not worry about what's going to happen. Let's look at this has happened, and then let's look at the journey to kind of get us to like the end, and focus more on the journey instead of the destination, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Anyone in the room or on Zoom? Okay, in which case we will go for a slightly early coffee, I think. And thank you so much. And yeah, let's give a round of applause for all three speakers.
Thank you.